All right, Chapter 17, Section 3, the wars in Korea and Vietnam. So, as you know, in the Cold War, the superpowers weren't actually ever able to fight each other because we would destroy each other with atomic weapons and quite possibly the world. So we fought through others. The first place where the Cold War turned hot was Korea, sometimes referred to as the Forgotten War, because America largely ignored it or did its best to ignore it. Now, why were we in Korea to begin with? Well, during World War II, Korea had been invaded by Japan, and the United States and the Soviet Union were in Korea fighting against Japan. And when World War II ended, we just stayed. We took half the country, they took the other half of the country. We both accepted surrenders from Japan, and we divided the country at the 38th parallel. And as our tensions grew worse and we started to not get along as much, that border between North and South Korea became even more tense. In 1950, the North Koreans, with the intent of unifying Korea into one country and, from their point of view, liberating the South Koreans from this capitalist government, invade South Korea. Well, there was not directly Soviet troops, but they had Soviet support. They had Soviet tanks, Soviet guns, and Soviet money. In South Korea, the small army requests assistance from the United States and the United Nations. 15 nations send troops from the United Nations, and the UN votes to defend South Korea. And part of the reason that vote went through was because the Soviet Union was not there that day. Most of the troops, however, were United States troops. The troops were led by Douglas MacArthur. He was an American general. And then by the time we get there and we get our act together, the North Koreans control most of the peninsula. There is a surprise attack at Incheon, which is an amphibious landing. It's one of the largest amphibious landings and one of the most massive invasions of an area since D-Day. And because we were pushed down to a tiny city called Busan, and we attack up from the north in Incheon, going behind enemy lines, we're able to do our own little pincer attack and get half of the North's army to surrender, and the rest retreat back north. Fighting continues. You can see on the map there's Incheon and Busan. There's the capital of South Korea, Seoul. There's Pyongyang, which is the capital of North Korea. The United Nations troops pushed North Koreans all the way to the border with China, which is the Yalu River. That makes China nervous because here we are, the UN troops, predominantly American. Americans admittedly have a policy against communism, and here it appears we're coming right at them. And Stalin was telling Mao, they're going to come for you next, you better defend yourself. So that is all the impetus that Mao needs to send troops over the Yalu River into North Korea. And the Chinese sent 300,000 troops, and they greatly outnumber the UN troops. One thing China has, it's people. And push the UN forces all the way back down, and they briefly recapture Seoul. MacArthur is, furious, and he calls for a nuclear attack when President Truman says, no, we're trying to prevent World War III not started. MacArthur goes to Congress and the press, and because he sort of tries to circumvent the president, that pisses off Truman, and Truman basically fires him. In 1953, there is a ceasefire, and the border is reestablished basically at the same place. 4 million people have died. The line is still there. It is a ceasefire. It's not officially a peace treaty. So technically, North and South Korea are still at war. They're just not actively fighting. But if you're paying attention to the news, that could change any day now. Aftermath of the war. North Korea builds collective farms, heavy industry, nuclear weapons, etc. South Korea establishes democracy and has a booming economy, in part due to the United States aid that we continue to send there. This is the demilitarized zone. You have the guys in brown. Those are the North Koreans. You have the dude in sort of the gray. Those are the South Koreans. And that literally, that concrete block in front of the North Koreans, that is the border. That is the 38th parallel. And they both stand on either side all day and night. Vietnam. All right, so there's a map of Vietnam and a couple of cool pictures. All right, leader of the Vietnamese resistance, Vietnamese nationalist leader Ho Chi Minh. All right, now the fighting actually does not begin with the United States. In 1954 is the end of the fighting with the French. The Vietnam was originally called Annam, or Annam and Tonkin, and it was a part of the French. It was a French colony, and it was the called the French Indochina. And you can see there's Cambodia, Laos. Siam, which is now Thailand, remained independent. But if you look up there, you can see there's Burma, which was controlled by the British. And so basically Vietnam was trying to get their independence from the French. And Ho Chi Minh, who was educated in France, actually helped lead the forces to their victory. And the last major battle that the French lost was Dien Bien Phu. And I think I spelled that wrong. Now, when it appears that this newly freed territory is leaning towards communism, the United States freaks out. And because of our theories of, domino theory, that if we let one country go communist, then the rest around them will go communist, we get involved and we help the French out a little bit. We get involved in the peace conference, and the International Peace Conference agrees on a divided Vietnam, because, apparently that works so well in Korea. So, the anti-communist government in South Vietnam is led by a guy named Ngo Dinh Diem. There he is on the cover of Time. And you can see there's the flag ripped in half. The Viet Cong are those that live in the South that are communist, and they're fighting against Diem's government. So even from the beginning, Diem doesn't have full control. And then after a while, it becomes pretty apparent even the South Vietnamese that don't want communism don't like him. And so the Vietnamese communists in the South are called the Viet Cong, and they fight guerrilla warfare and do anything they can to try to unseat Diem. So, of course, the United States gets involved. Diem calls for help. In '64, the U.S. sends troops to fight the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese. The U.S. fights this guerrilla war, which we're not very good at this point. And it's even worse because we are defending a government that the people don't even want. So not only do they hate their government, they hate us for trying to keep a government that's bad. And so the Viet Cong continues to gain support from the North Vietnamese and also from the Soviet Union. The war gets increasingly unpopular in the United States. By 1969, Nixon starts to withdraw troops. He calls it Vietnamization, which is the plan that American soldiers will leave. We could send money, we can send guns, we can send helicopters, but we won't send guys. The fighting needs to be done by the Vietnamese, which doesn't work out. The last U.S. troops finally leave Vietnam in 1973, and essentially the Vietnamese troops, the South Vietnamese troops, get trampled by the North. This is the famous picture of the fall of Saigon, which is anyone who supported either Diem's regime or the United States trying desperately to get out of Saigon before the communist forces of the North get there and execute or imprison them. You have a line of people trying to get on a very tiny helicopter. As you can imagine, it was pretty awful. You'll learn a lot more about this in U.S. history, and I don't want to belabor it too much. Plus, we're going to be watching some videos. Post-war Southeast Asia. After the war, Saigon was retaken by the North and is renamed Ho Chi Minh City, and Vietnam is united, and it is a communist nation. About 1.5 million people flee Vietnam. Some settle in the United States, some settle in Canada. And by 1995, the U.S. is ready to normalize our relations with Vietnam, and people now travel there. Cambodia. Oh, this is a brutal story. We bomb Cambodia. We bomb the heck out of Cambodia and Laos. Because a lot of times the Vietnamese soldiers in the Viet Cong or in North Vietnam would come around through Laos or Cambodia and use those countries to hide in, etc. So even though we had no problem with those countries, we bombed them. And in this turmoil, in this chaos we help create, you get a crazy man who calls himself Pol Pot, P-O-L-P-O-T, and he is a communist rebel, and he takes control of Cambodia in 1975. And he creates this mass genocide against his own people. Eventually, the Vietnamese figure out something is wrong because Cambodia has gone completely in lockdown, and the North Vietnamese invade Cambodia and overthrow this guy. In 1993, Cambodia adopts democracy and holds elections with the United Nations help. But literally, it isn't until almost the 1980s when somebody makes a film called The Killing Fields that people in America realize, oh my gosh, what happened there? That, you know, people by the hundreds were just lined up and you know, macheted to death. It was just, I mean, the stories are just, they're really horrific. And, you know, this is sort of the famous picture. I mean, just, you know, these mass graves, finding hundreds of thousands of people buried just in these big, huge pits. And it's called The Killing Fields. And they would just walk people out by the hundreds of thousands and line them up and kill them and bury them and keep going. And some of the people of the Khmer Rouge, the regime that was in charge of this, are still being brought to trial today. Some are still hiding in the jungles of Cambodia. It's mind-blowing.